The concept of ecclesia versus the conception of church in 9 minutes. In that same way that the printing press broke the monopoly of interpretation, pulling sacred texts out of cloistered cathedrals and priestly and courtly hands, and placed it into the homes of ordinary people, creating quite a revolution. Now AI and the digital realm is doing something very similar but far more revolutionary. This time, it's not by printing pages, but by dissolving language and interpretation barriers. A single person can now turn the church on its side because he can move across Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, Latin, German, English and modern scholarship in minutes. Not as a scholar in a thought-entrapping or thought-shaping monastery or seminary, but as a sovereign, free-thinking person with something as basic as a phone. Revelation 16:18 KJV says, "And there were voices and thunders and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth. So mighty an earthquake and so great." Well, to quote the old hippie, the times they are a-changing. And that's not just referring to a metaphorical tectonic earthquake. Here's an interesting definition for that word tectonic, in light of what I'm about to convey. According to the Oxford Online Dictionary, the two definitions of the word tectonic are both quite telling. But for now, I'm going to focus on the second one. Here's a copy and paste of that definition. Definition number 2, relating to building or construction. A contest of tectonic quality and public attractiveness. Both definitions are very reflective of that earthquake that the book of the Revelation of Jesus talks about in chapter 16, within that 7th vial judgment, from that verse that opened this diatribe. And if you have watched my previous videos, you would know that that is exactly where it is. That I believe anyways, that we are. Right here and right now, in the eschatological timetable. One could go back and see where it is that I get the source, or the support for saying and believing that seemingly weird position. This is as good of a place as any to discuss that conception of the church, in the light of that second definition of the word tectonic that I shared. Are we on the verge of a tectonic shift in the church's real place in this modern world? Seismic change that comes from our true understanding of the very building and construction of the conception of church. Please hear me out here. Somewhere along the line, that word slipped into or was birthed into our culture, and it slowly and insidiously changed everything. The New Testament original manuscripts do not use the word church. That word simply isn't there. The word is ecclesia, a Greek term that means a called-out assembly, a people gathered in response to something indeed. But ecclesia is not a structure, not a hierarchy, or even an institution with offices and titles and membership cards. Ecclesia is just people summoned and responding and freely moving and freely living together. But over time, that word ecclesia was translated and then translated again, and with each step something else crept in. Not just linguistic choices, but doctrinal, religious assumptions. The kind of assumptions that don't announce themselves, but the kind that felt settled by the time that we inherited them. Eventually, church became more than a word. It became both a metaphorical and a literal container. A place you go, a thing you belong to, a system with authority built into it, rather than something that emerges from free-willed people living out and through their faith. This wasn't random. It was a purposeful hermeneutical containment, the very kind of containment that Jesus despised, as I'll go into. Once the religious doctrine solidified, it didn't just protect itself going forward, it also reached backwards. It began to shape how the text itself was rendered, so that the translation appeared to confirm the religious church structure that grew up around it. Biblical meaning flowed downstream, from institution to the text instead of the other way, from the text to the free-willed child of God, and that's where something subtle happened. Christianity, which began as a movement of people called out of the religious trappings that Jesus despised, taught and railed against, and even got strung up for, with his talk of the good news, the kingdom of God life, that the Pharisees, Sadducees and scribes found as the unacceptable affront upon their religious paradigm. Christianity slowly gave way to something else, something more managed, more contained, more predictable, more controllable, more guilt and shame-ridden, more religious. Not Christianity as such, but what might fairly be an unintended paradigm that one might call churchianity, a faith organized around attendance instead of transformation, around submission to structure rather than response to calling, around maintaining the institution rather than embodying the message of relationship to God's kingdom. This isn't a rejection of faith, it's a question about religious origins. Because when words change, imagination changes with them. And when imagination changes, theology follows soon after, whether we notice it or or even want to notice it or not. But now, for the first time in centuries, ordinary people can look behind the translations. They can see the older words, compare contexts, watch meanings shift across languages and time. Not as scholars in ivory towers or even ivory pulpits, but as seekers with access. And that's why this moment feels quite unsettling to institutions and energizing to individuals. Because when people rediscover the original language, they don't just read it differently. They begin to ask whether what we're calling church still resembles the original ecclesia at all. And this questioning, once it takes root, will never stay in that container for long. What once required institutions, gatekeepers, and credentialed interpreters now opens out to all of humanity. We now have access to multiple translations, multiple traditions, multiple lenses, even giving us abilities to compare differing theologies and understanding different cultural contexts and illumination onto our historical framing of the biblical text. Now contradictions can be placed side by side for scrutiny. Even parallels across all religions can be seen, all visible, all accessible, not filtered through a single doctrinal funnel. And that changes the power structure of meaning of that we have come to call religion itself, an earthquake of magnitude never experienced by men, as prophesied. The common man is no longer dependent on inherited interpretation alone. He can test it, cross-reference it, question it, reread it through other languages and older forms. He can see how words' meanings shift across time, how our modern theology is shaped by translation, and how doctrine often follows religious language more than religious language follows real truth. That's not just technological access, it's epistemic decentralization, meaning a freeing up of how it is that we get to know things, the nature of our knowledge, and the justification for our beliefs. Sure, not everyone will use it wisely, and I'm sure that not everyone will use it humbly, but this new structure of our understanding itself is irreversible. Meaning is no longer centrally mediated, interpretation is no longer vertically or religiously controlled. True understanding is becoming much more widely distributed, and that, whether sacred or secular, is always the beginning of a shaking earthquake or a revolution. In the same way that we once lived in a time when sacred texts lived behind gates, locked in ancient languages, guarded by institutions, interpreted by a small priesthood of scholars and authorities, when the printing press arrived and suddenly enabled the common man to be able to hold the Bible in his own hands, read it in his own language, and wrestle with its meaning without permission. It didn't just change religion, it reconfigured power. Now, something similar is happening again. Artificial intelligence has become a new kind of printing press. One that dissolves linguistic barriers, compares translations in seconds, surfaces forgotten interpretations, and lets ordinary people explore texts once accessible only to specialists. The common reader is no longer dependent on a single tradition, a single translation, or most importantly, a single voice of authority. Meaning has become searchable, cross-referenced, and contested in real time. If the printing press sparked the Reformation, AI is sparking something even more gloriously divine. Not merely new doctrines, but new ways of seeing, questioning, and inhabiting the meaning of meaning itself. An era where interpretation is no longer inherited, it can be actively constructed. And revolutions often begin not with weapons, but with words newly placed into the hands of those who were never intended by the religious powers that be to hold them. So in this unfolding of divine singularity, we find ourselves at another inflection point. Swiss biblical translator, philosopher, and theologian François Dutoit hints that meaning itself is decentralizing, moving from institutional control into shared human engagement. Dutoit suggests, in a way that sums it all up, that from the earliest translations, religious presuppositions subtly shaped interpretation. Those religious assumptions often guided how certain words were rendered, reinforcing existing beliefs. Over time, religious hermeneutical habits became entrenched, and layers of religious tradition influenced how people understood the Bible. Thus, interpretation became a dialogue, not just with the text, but with centuries of religious doctrinal lenses. Doctrinal religious gatekeepers may have built the guardrails, but those rails now tremble from the earthquake. The revolution isn't loud and obvious, it's quiet and just now starting to rumble. We are not just reading ancient sacred texts, we are reclaiming the authority to truly understand them, across languages, time, meaning, and into the realm of actual relationship with our Creator. The singularity of interpretation has begun, and I'll dare to say that it is divinely inspired.
And I shall say, glory, glory, his truth marches on.